for coming. This has actually been sort of not far off the average attendance. We've averaged about 25 or so per event so far. It's not the sexiest of subjects, and I appreciate that. That's why I really appreciate you coming. But that aside, it's my opinion, and it is just a personal opinion, this is quite possibly the most important subject I've ever picked on to discuss, because it's right here, it's right now. And as you know, if you're familiar with my work, you'll be aware that normally I'm looking at what's coming down the pipe in 5, 10, 20 more years beyond. But here I'm talking about something that is pretty much right on top of us, and that's why I changed my original plans for 2013 and decided that I really had to focus on this particular issue. So what I'm going to do through the evening, and we'll split the evening into two, so I won't keep you sitting around too long so that you can pay even more for an exorbitant beer. We'll take a break about 9 o'clock for about 15 minutes or so, and then the second half will be about an hour plus some time for questions. Okay? And if previous events are anything to go by, then you will go away from this and you will tell other people about it. And hopefully you'll tell them tomorrow, because I'm doing this event in Sheffield tomorrow. And then I think that I'm not really back on the eastern side of the Pennines for the rest of the tour. I'll be the other side over in Manchester. But as you'll see, that this area is perhaps, how should I say, a primary target. And yet very, very few people are aware of it. Because all the media focus has been on Blackpool and the Fylde Peninsula, and a little bit on Sussex, a little bit on Somerset. But it's here, it's right up all the old eastern Pennines coal seams that I think are the real targets. And it's a case of distract with Blackpool and then keep everyone thinking that it's the Lancashire issue, when in reality this is the real target. And you'll see why as we go through. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a bit the bigger picture for you, because I want you to see why it is that this issue has come about at this particular time, and who it is that's driving it. Because once you start to see some of the players involved, it helps to put some of the things in perspective, and maybe some of the things that are sort of a bit inexplicable, but when you see the deeper agenda, it'll fall into place. And why this is so important to us, just to really show you the core issue here. 64% of England sits above shale gas or coal bed methane. So the media is focused on here, for reasons that I'll explain as we go through, here, and to a lesser extent here and here, when I think this is the real target. And we just happen to be pretty much right in the middle of that, right here, right now. And yet, very, very few people are aware of it, and that is the deception. That's almost the brilliance of the deception, to keep people focused on another part of the country whilst they're really looking at here. But let's go back a few years. Let's go back 3 years. Because 3 years ago, I was focusing on another event. Remember this? The BP Deepwater Horizon disaster. And this was very significant for me for a number of reasons. Not least, the day before, I'd actually put out a newsletter stating that I had a strong sense that something was about to go down, something of great significance. And I had this feeling a couple of times before, and one in 2006 when I was in Chicago, and I've told that story elsewhere, and again in 2009. But this time in 2010, I really sensed that something was going to happen on April the 19th. And April the 19th is very significant in the occult calendar of those who think they're the rightful rulers of this planet. They got a bit ahead of themselves this year. They went with April the 15th instead of April the 19th. But April the 19th/20th is the day of sacrifice by fire. The birthday of Isis. And if we just go back 20 years, we look at the events that occurred on April the 19th through 20th over that period. I'm just going to recount a few. Because in 1993, on April the 19th, we had the firestorm at Waco, when some 72 people, mainly women and children, were killed by being burnt because they were in the basement of the David Koresh compound in Waco, Texas, where the Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms Division had waited specifically for that date, or somebody had made the decision to wait for that date, because there'd been a standoff outside the compound for nearly 2 months. 2 years later, supposedly it was a revenge attack by a lone bombman, a guy called Timothy McVeigh, on the Alfred P. Murrah building in Oklahoma City. Now if you look at the photographic evidence that still exists on the web from that particular date, most of the video footage of the news reports in the immediate aftermath have been removed from the web because they tell a slightly different story than the one for the official version, funnily enough. They talk about unexploded bombs, which is why the first responders weren't permitted to go into the building, because unexploded devices had been uncovered. Well, the Ryder truck bomb that Timothy McVeigh supposedly put outside the building was remarkable, because it appeared to have sucked off the front of the building, thrown it over the top of the truck, and deposited it 300 yards in that direction. When you look at the photographic evidence, you can actually see that what occurred was that the explosive devices were placed on the central support columns and, of course, blew the whole of the front of the building off. But Timothy McVeigh and his Ryder truck bomb were the patsies on this occasion. Roll the clock on to 1999. April the 19th is the day of the Columbine High School massacre. April 20th in 2005 was actually the day of Pope Benedict coming into office. And it was April 20th was Hitler's birthday, and it's the Queen's official birthday. Well, I had just had a sense in 2010 that something was going to go down, and I was holed up in a hotel room in Lisbon because I couldn't fly back to London because of a volcano that had gone off a few days before in Iceland and was supposedly putting an ash cloud across the northern European skies. You should remember that period because it's the clearest skies anybody's ever seen in years. And Lisbon wasn't too bad either, but you know, I really wanted to get home. I was on my way back from having visited my daughter in Mozambique. So it was the morning of April 21st when I woke up, and I had literally hundreds of emails from people who'd opened my newsletter asking if the event that occurred the night before was the event I'd been talking about. Well, I was reading the emails before I even knew what they were talking about because I hadn't caught up with the event. And when I first discovered that this is what had happened the night before, at 9:20 in the evening in New Orleans time, so that was about, it would have been about 2:20 in the morning European time, I was reluctant to say that this was the event because there was no evidence to suggest that this was the event that I'd been talking about. But it had resulted in the loss of 11 lives. But of course, fortunately, no women and children on this occasion. Well, it took me 7 weeks to really nail down the fact that this was not an accident. And I focused on a couple of individuals. This guy definitely wasn't involved. This guy was the guy who was the most senior person on the rig at the time. In fact, at the time, he's retired now, but at the time he was one of the most experienced company men, i.e. the senior supervisors in the BP deep water drilling fleet. And inexplicably, he was taken off the rig on April the 16th. And this photograph is of him giving evidence before the Gulf Coast Commission. And when you watch the video footage of him giving evidence, you can see from, and hear from the tone of his voice and the body language, that he's not really convinced about the reason that he was taken off the rig. Supposedly he was taken off because his safety certificate was coming up for renewal, but it wasn't that critical, and yet the rig was, as we know, a bit of a rogue rig. There had been some problems with it, and this was exactly the guy that you really needed on the rig at that time, but he was taken off. This is his counterpart, because the company men on the rig work 12 hours on, 12 hours off. And so this was his counterpart, and he obviously would have deferred to this guy. Well, this guy was replaced by a guy called Bob Kaluza, who was one of the least experienced men in the BP deepwater drilling fleet. And I'm not going to go through the whole saga tonight, but there are at least 3 decisions that he made between his arrival on the rig on April the 16th and the explosion at 9:20 in the evening on April 20th that absolutely defy belief. And the ultimate decision that absolutely defies any comprehension is that 2 of the engineers from my former company, Schlumberger, were on that rig. And they were on that rig to run what is called the cement bond log. Now this is the final test of the cement casing in the well to make sure that basically that cement is going to hold the casing in place once the well is opened to production. Now, as we now know, there were some problems with the cement, but nonetheless, the Schlumberger engineers were there to ensure that the cement integrity was absolute. And so when they hooked their equipment up and discovered that the well was kicking, which basically means that it was vibrating. Now, I'm exaggerating when I do that because the vibration would have been so microscopic, that's why you need instruments to be able to measure it. But once it is vibrating, that's it. You know it's only going to get worse. It's not going to get better. So the Schlumberger engineers instructed this guy to shut down the well. I mean, that's what they're employed to do. They are the third-party, independent adjudicators of the integrity of the cement. They are trained to make these decisions. Fortunately, they don't have to make them very often in the course of their career. But when they do have to make the decision, they make it with absolute confidence, because they also know that if they're wrong, they will never work again, because nobody will have them on the rig. So either Schlumberger has to redeploy them, or basically it's the end of their career. But consequently, I mean, because of their training, these guys know that when they make this decision, it is the only decision that can be made. And like I said, if they are wrong, I mean, Schlumberger actually has to pick up the tab for all the reparations to get the rig back on track again. But in this case, Bob Kaluza turned around and said, "Not on my watch." Now this is absolutely inexplicable. You know, here was an opportunity to shut the well in. He was being told that there was only one possible outcome of this, and that was that the well was going to blow. Now he may have felt under some pressure, because believe it or not, there was a whole bunch of senior BP dignitaries on the rig who were there because the rig crew were going to be given a safety award the following day. How ironic is that? Anyway, the bottom line is he didn't shut the well in, and the Schlumberger engineers were totally spooked because they knew what was going to happen. So it's a matter of public record that the Schlumberger engineers called their boss in New Orleans, who immediately understood the magnitude of the situation. And whether or not that Schlumberger boss in New Orleans called BP, we don't know. But what he did do was he chartered a helicopter and had the helicopter flown out to the rig. And it's, like I said, a matter of public record that the Schlumberger engineers were evacuated from the rig at 11 o'clock on the morning of April 20th. 10.5 hours later, the rig blew, with the loss of 11 lives. Well, I immediately started to drill through the evidence that was available because, you know, thanks to the web, a lot of people were getting their accounts onto the web. You know, a lot of people who were working on the rig wanting to make sure that everybody knew that they had nothing to do with it. This guy, though, wasn't posting very much at all, but what was very clear was that this guy had some very, very difficult questions that needed to be answered. The problem was that when Obama set up the Gulf Coast Commission, which he instructed the Coast Guard, the US Coast Guard, to chair, the Coast Guard very quickly ran into a problem, because this guy pleaded the Fifth Amendment, which is the opportunity under the US Constitution that any individual charged with a crime or suspected of having perpetrated a criminal offence can elect to say nothing, on the grounds that anything they do say might actually incriminate them, and therefore, you know, they're best remain silent. Well, not only that, but Halliburton refused to identify the cementing engineer that was on the rig, and Schlumberger refused to identify the cementing engineers that were on the rig. So the Coast Guard realised that they were in a bit of a problem here, because it was going to be extremely difficult for them to get to the bottom of what occurred if this guy, the cementing engineer, and the Schlumberger engineers weren't available. It was going to be a bit of a charade. So the Coast Guard went to Washington and they asked the House of Representatives to initiate the process of passing legislation to give the Coast Guard Commission the power of subpoena. Now that means the power to demand that these guys present themselves, demand that Halliburton and Schlumberger present the persons of interest that have been identified, and of course demand that they actually answer any question that the Coast Guard put to them. Well, that should seem like a no-brainer, because obviously it was becoming increasingly apparent that the magnitude of this disaster was enormous. And of course it was exacerbated by BP spraying nearly 2 million gallons of a very toxic chemical known as Corexit on top of the slick. And the reason they did this was to make the slick disappear, because BP's lawyers established that their liability, the company liability, was based on the size of a visible slick. So somebody had the smart-ass idea, well, let's just make it invisible. And the chemists came up with Corexit, which increased the toxicity of the spill 11-fold, caused the slick to expand because it did dilute it, but it also caused it to sink, therefore making it invisible. It's perverse, isn't it? It's really perverse. But even by June of 2010, the local residents in Louisiana and in Mississippi and northern Florida were already starting to feel some of the effects of this. Of course, the beaches were a mess, but people were starting to get headaches and get lesions, all of which, of course, was inexplicable at the time, but everyone knew that it probably had to be related to the BP disaster, because that was the only thing that had changed in the area. So it should have been a no-brainer that this piece of legislation should have whistled through and become law. Well, it went through the House of Representatives very, very quickly. In the final reading in the House of Representatives, it was passed by 420 votes to 1. Every Republican in the House for that vote voted in favour of the Coast Guard having the power of subpoena. Of the Democrats, only one objected, and that one was a very strange one, because it was Ron Paul. I can only assume that Ron Paul wasn't particularly well briefed on this, but anyway, it didn't really matter, because it passed the final reading in the House of Representatives by 420 votes to 1. So the next stage of the process is for the bill to go to the Senate. Well, it went through the first 2 readings in the Senate, and what I'm going to show you is I'm going to show you the video footage from the last 3 minutes of the debate in the Senate, where we should have seen the power of subpoena being granted to the Coast Guard hearing.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Judiciary Committee be discharged of S-3462, a bill to provide subpoena power to the National Commission on the British petroleum oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, and that the Senate then proceed to its consideration.
Is there objection?
On behalf of other members of the Republican Conference, I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam President?
Senator from New Hampshire.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 442 H.R. 5481, a bill to give subpoena power to the National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill and offshore drilling, that the bill be read a 3rd time and passed, and the motion to consider be laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate. This is legislation that passed the House 420 to 1.
Is there objection?
On behalf of other members of the Republican Conference, I object.
The objection is heard.
Madam President,
the Senator from New Hampshire.
I don't understand what is so objectionable. In the House, 169 Republicans voted in favor of giving the Presidential Commission subpoena power. They understand how important that is, because this commission begins their investigation in the next few weeks. This should not be a partisan issue. I don't understand why my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are turning this into a partisan issue. I find it unbelievable that after everything the people of the Gulf region have endured and that this entire country has witnessed for over 2 months now, that anyone is still standing with the oil company that caused this disaster instead of the victims who are suffering from it.
I hope the American people understand that this is a clear contrast between who stands on your side and who stands on the side of special interests. How is it possible that members of this chamber find it difficult when the House of Representatives, in a near unanimous vote, could say that the subpoena powers necessary for the commission to be able to get to the bottom of what happened could pass unanimously there, save for one vote, and yet cannot even proceed here? Cannot even proceed here. This isn't rocket science. It's common sense to most Americans. We need to fully learn the lessons of this disaster with a thorough investigation, not protect oil companies from having their negligence exposed. We need to get answers from BP and Transocean and Halliburton and everyone else, including the federal agencies, not give apologies to them, as I have seen Republicans suggest that we should apologize to BP for making sure that the residents of the Gulf region are held whole. We need to know the truth, and the commission needs subpoena power to get the truth. So who are you protecting? And what are we hiding here?
So do you appreciate what it is that you've just witnessed? What you have just seen is prima facie evidence that the US is controlled by the corporations. So it's a corporatocracy, which just so happens to be the definition of fascism. So here was the Senate effectively shutting down the Gulf Coast Commission from being able to get to the bottom of what occurred. Now, I recorded a presentation called BP Population Reduction and the End of an Age in early July of 2010. And when I put that presentation on Amazon, Amazon managed to hide it for nearly 7 months. It wasn't until February of 2011 that it was actually visible on my Amazon shop. And it was many phone calls and many emails before Amazon suddenly decided that there was a technical problem, and it was now resolved and it became visible. But the reason these two guys were in silhouette is because BP had managed to remove every single photograph of these guys from the web. Now I know that the photographs were there because when I was first doing this research in the immediate aftermath of the disaster, the photographs were certainly there. Unfortunately, I didn't actually save them at that time because it never occurred to me that BP would manage to get them all removed. But the good news is that I can now show you the photographs of these guys. Well, a lot happened in the meantime, but if you Google Ian Crane BP, or BP disaster, you will find a whole bunch of websites which claim that I have been served with a $10 million lawsuit. Well, let me just put the record straight. First of all, it's a crock of crap. The lawsuit doesn't exist. But what does exist is about 20 or 30 websites that were created almost overnight, all saying that I and a journalist by the name of Deborah Dupre in the US had been served with this lawsuit. And the specific reference to me was that I had allegedly, illegally recorded a telephone conversation. Well, here's the actual facts. I did record a telephone conversation. But I'm not stupid enough to contravene Florida law. So there was a particular individual who I wanted to speak to, and I sent him an email asking him to call me. And I was actually quite surprised when he did call me. But when he called me and I answered the phone, I told him that I wasn't available to speak to him at that particular moment and that I would have to call him back in about 20 minutes. Had I recorded the conversation when he called me, the call would have been covered by Florida law, in which case it would indeed have been illegal to record that telephone conversation without his express permission. But when I called him back, the call was covered by UK law. And in the UK, it is not illegal to record a telephone conversation without the other party's permission, but it is illegal to share that recording with anybody else without the other party's permission, unless the other party is a judge. Well, the whole point of these massive emails being put on the web was to literally ensure that anybody Googling Ian Crane BP would immediately see that I'd been served with a $10 million lawsuit, and therefore to marginalise anything that I was putting out on the subject. And the purpose of that was because the particular individual concerned absolutely wanted to make sure that that phone call did not go into the public domain. So funnily enough, I have some very, very deep concerns and suspicions about that particular individual and what he was doing in the Gulf Coast in the immediate aftermath of the Deepwater Horizon disaster. My suspicion is that he was not necessarily directly on the payroll of BP, but probably through various agencies, and his role was to make sure that anyone getting a bit too close to the truth was effectively derailed. In the BP accounts for the post-Deepwater Horizon period, there's a line in those accounts which actually says behavioural adjustment payments, of which $52 million has been paid out. Well, this is hush money. A lot of that money has been paid to universities around the Gulf Coast to make sure that all the faculties in those universities do not take a specific interest in BP or in the Deepwater Horizon disaster. Because the funding that BP offer obviously is tied with clauses that ensure that they don't actually make any negative comment about BP's activities in the Gulf of Mexico. For individuals, if an individual started to speak to the press or get YouTube videos out talking about their particular experiences, then they'd get a visit from BP, and basically it was, how much? How much do you want? And with the money, and not everyone took it, that's for sure, but with the money you signed a clause basically stating that you would not in any way, shape or form criticise BP. This is behavioural adjustment payments. Now remember that, because we're going to see the British version of behavioural adjustment payments a bit later on tonight. Well, the reason that I'm able to show these photographs is thanks to the work of literally a very small number of Gulf Coast activists and a journalist by the name of Deborah Dupre, who actually appreciated the significance of this guy. And so the evidence, if you like, that I and the other Gulf Coast researchers had accumulated, the journalist helped us to ensure that that information got to the appropriate attorneys in the US who were actually representing people who were initiating claims against Kaluza. And in the end, it was actually picked up by the Attorney General's office in Washington. And these two guys have now been served. In fact, last November, they were indicted on 11 counts of involuntary manslaughter. So I'm just going to show you a very short clip of Bob Kaluza speaking outside the courtroom after he'd been indicted on 11 counts of manslaughter.
Sean Clark, and with me are Bob Kaluza and David Gerger. Thank you all for being here, and the first thing that we would like is Bob would like to say a few words to you.
I think
Okay, well,
I think about the tragedy of the Deepwater Horizon every day. But I did not cause this tragedy. I'm innocent, and I put my trust, reputation, and future in the hands of the judge and the jury. Thank you.
thank you, Bob. Everyone whose life has been affected by this tragedy deserves justice. But justice must be based on truth. And this indictment isn't true. Bob Kaluza and Don Vidrine are innocent of the charges against them. Bob and Don did their jobs, they did them correctly, and they did them in accordance with their training.
Some interesting doublespeak there. Bob and Don did their jobs, they did them correctly, and they did them in accordance with their training. Well, that would be the base point at which I would start the questioning from there, as to exactly what it was that they've been trained to do, particularly this guy. But Louisiana isn't exactly renowned as having the most robust legal system on the planet. So we've got a long, long, long way to go here, and the likelihood of it actually coming to court in January of 2014, which is when it's scheduled to come to court, is actually probably quite remote. And the real issue is whether or not Halliburton and Schlumberger can be persuaded to produce the relevant individuals, i.e. the cementing engineer and the 2 cement bond log engineers. And I would suggest that that is probably not going to happen. In fact, since this, Halliburton have had their health and safety, their senior health and safety executive actually state that there is a distinct possibility that Halliburton might have been partly responsible for what occurred. Not the engineer, not the cementing engineer, he hasn't said anything, but Halliburton themselves have said, we might have been responsible. Then what's really incredible is Transocean, who owned the rig, who had nothing at all to do with the drilling operation. They are purely there for matters marine because it's a floating rig. And they've said, well, you know what, we might have actually had something to do with it as well. Now Schlumberger just haven't said anything at all, they've been very silent. So why do these companies now stand up and say, well, we might have had something to do with it, when in reality, I know they didn't? Exactly. It's this, it's protecting revenue. BP, in the space of barely 15 years, went from being a second-rate national oil company, known as British Petroleum, to BP and becoming the 6th largest oil company on the planet. And Halliburton, Transocean and Schlumberger are reliant on BP for a very significant chunk of their global revenues. So what they've done, by putting their hands up voluntarily and saying, well, we might have been a little bit responsible, is they've helped to mitigate the BP liability. And of course what they've done is they've also made sure that they've got BP over the proverbial barrel, so that they can pretty much guarantee that their revenues from BP are going to be protected. They will get preferential treatment in any bidding process. So this is the corporations just closing ranks. That's the way the global corporatocracy works. And of course, although BP got nailed supposedly for $42 billion in terms of damages on the Gulf Coast, most of that is actually paid by the US taxpayer because it's written off as an operating expense. So this is the corporations dominating the whole legal scenario here. Now, the lady involved, the journalist involved, Deborah Dupre, she, earlier this year, she published a book of her research and her experience in trying to get this information out to the right people. Funnily enough, she couldn't find a single publisher, despite the fact she is a published author, despite the fact that she is an established journalist, she couldn't find a single publishing house in the US to pick up the project to publish her book. So she had to self-publish it, and right now she's touring the US trying to promote that book. So the reason I wanted to focus on BP here is because of the players involved. And although this particular individual wasn't the chairman of, or chief executive officer of BP at the time of the Deepwater Horizon disaster, there's no doubt in my mind that when this guy was the CEO, and later the CEO and chairman of BP, he certainly made a lot of enemies within the global oil industry. That's this guy here. Today he's known as Lord John Brown. And he's here with a couple of actors. one of whom would, of course, openly admit that he's an actor. And the US, of course, has absolutely no problem in putting an actor into senior political roles. I mean, they did it with Reagan, and they certainly did it with this guy. And this is the guy who demonstrated his intellect when he got the Senate of California to sign the bill that effectively condemned California to bankruptcy. And the way he got them to sign it was by making the incredibly intellectually demanding statement that if you don't sign this bill, you're a bunch of girly men. And they gave him a standing ovation and signed the bill. And within 12 months, California was totally bankrupt. But no, he can't be held out as an example, because every other state in the US, with one exception, is bankrupt. And of course, the one state that isn't bankrupt is North Dakota, and that is the only state that isn't part of the Federal Reserve. It's been outside of the Federal Reserve System since 1922, but it was always considered to be, a small state, 300,000 people, mainly Swedish farmers, so it can operate outside the Federal Reserve System. And that was thanks to a visionary governor that they had back in the 1910s and early 1920s, who realised that the Federal Reserve Act was all about getting the states into debt. So anyway, he was the guy who took what at the time was the 6th largest economy on the planet, California, into bankruptcy. This guy is an arch socio-psychopath. He is currently sulking, of course, because he didn't make Pope. He converted to Catholicism, he didn't realise there was any more to it. But of course he is on the bench right now, out in the Middle East. He's a Middle East peace advisor, no comment. But he's on the bench because he is being groomed, and always has been groomed, to be the EU president. Of course, he wanted to be the first EU president, but the puppet masters wanted to create the impression that the role of EU president is simply a sinecure. It's just a ceremonial role, just chairs a few meetings of the European Parliament, nothing really too powerful. Yet, if you've read the Treaty of Lisbon makes it very clear that the President of the EU has despotic powers. And this socio-psychopath won't hesitate to use them. And in fact, I only need to give you one account to really put this guy's mental state into perspective. And you won't find this interview on YouTube, because anytime anybody tries to put it up, it gets taken down immediately. And this is an interview with Andrew Marr in 2009. Now, Andrew Marr's no Jeremy Paxman, but he sort of creeps up on the jugular and then gets the fingers around the throat. Well, the question went like this. It was, so Mr. Blair, how do you actually sleep at night knowing that some 500,000 Iraqi civilians, mainly women and children, lost their lives as a result of a war that we now know to be based on the false premise of weapons of mass destruction? And Blair's response is just so telling, because he leans forward and he says, Andrew, I think you'll find it was only 100,000. So that makes it all right. I mean, Andrew Marr was just gobsmacked. I mean, totally gobsmacked. He was actually lost for words for about 3 or 4 seconds. How do you respond to that? Without going, so that's all right then. But you or I, or any normal human being, would be mortified if we thought that we made a decision, and especially an incorrect decision, that had led to somebody else being emotionally wounded, let alone physically wounded, let alone killed. And yet this guy can justify it that it was only 100,000. And of course, when he's pushed now, his standard response is, you wouldn't understand, it was very, very complex. Well, how arrogant can you get? So this is the guy who made this guy a knight and created this guy as a life peer. His track record at BP, if you just look at the pure business aspect in terms of profitability, was indeed exceptional. but at what cost? He spent his entire career at BP, having joined BP straight out of college from Cambridge, and worked his way up through the ranks, and at a very young age was appointed Chief Executive Officer. Whilst he was Chief Executive Officer, he had a very interesting mentor, who I'll introduce you to in just a second. But then latterly he was Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, and whilst he was in that role, he was predatory. That was how he took BP from being a second-rate national oil company to the 6th largest oil company on the planet. He was absolutely predatory. He didn't allow anything to get in his way. It was always through acquisition. And in fact, he created a situation where the other major American oil companies, particularly Exxon, were also forced to become predatory because they wanted to ensure that they could compete on an even footing with BP. So consequently, I think that there was an element of targeting BP for the BP Deepwater Horizon disaster as a way of getting back at this guy's predatory approach in terms of buying up American oil companies such as Amoco and Arco, and dominating the North Slope of Alaska. But he was out of the frame a little while, about 2007. He actually announced that he would retire in 2008. He made that announcement in 2006. And what forced him to make that announcement was that although he was lauded over by the business media, here we go, the Forbes magazine, BP Amoco, the hottest prospect in the oil patch, but there were others who weren't quite so keen on him, particularly those that had an interest in health and the safety and the environment. Because this guy's mantra was profit before all else. An example of this is when BP took over the companies working on the North Slope of Alaska. And the American companies prided themselves on basically doing everything that they could to protect the pristine condition of the Arctic tundra. Because they knew that they had a responsibility. They accepted that responsibility. And they accepted that there was a cost associated with that responsibility. But when those companies were acquired by BP, BP took out all expenses that weren't directly associated with revenue generation, which led to major incidents, oil spills, particularly with the Trans-Alaskan pipeline. There were numerous spills during BP's tenure, primarily because maintenance had been cut. Well, the final straw was an explosion at a Texas refinery, which led to the loss of 15 lives. And then there were calls for this guy basically to resign and to be accountable for this appalling safety record and this appalling maintenance record under his tenure. Well, this guy has more Teflon on his skin than even Tony. And there was no sign of any legal proceedings being initiated. But he did not realise that he was starting to be under some pressure. So he announced that he would retire in 2006, but that he would retire in 2008. And a guy called Tony Hayward was lined up to be his successor. Of course, Tony Hayward was the guy who was found seriously lacking in his abilities to handle the fallout of the Deepwater Horizon disaster. But this guy, something else led to his downfall. It wasn't his mercenary, cavalier attitude in the boardroom. It was his personal life that led to his downfall. Because one of the Sunday newspapers, the Mail on Sunday, published an article in early 2007 stating that Lord John Brown was gay, which was probably the worst kept secret in the oil industry anyway, but you know, so what? But the allegation here in the Mail on Sunday was that he was using BP funds. He was effectively claiming expenses to finance his gay lover's lifestyle. Well, the other allegation made by the Mail on Sunday was that he had actually met his gay lover on a gay dating website known as Booted and Suited. Now, he didn't challenge the allegation over his sexuality. Smart move. But what he did do was he challenged the fact that he was financing his gay lover's lifestyle through BP expenses, and he also challenged the veracity of the claim that he had met his partner through a gay dating website. And he actually initiated legal proceedings against the Mail on Sunday. Well, the Mail on Sunday, like any newspaper, ain't going to run stories like that unless they are 200% sure of their facts. So when John Brown went before the High Court and stated categorically, on oath, that he had not met his gay lover on a website, he had met him whilst jogging in a South London park. And then the Mail on Sunday basically sort of fed his legal team bit by bit. They didn't let it all go out at once. They wanted to see how far this guy was prepared to go in terms of committing perjury. So for 2 weeks, this guy, on oath, lied before the High Court judge, stating categorically that it was an outright lie that he had met his partner on a gay website. Well, eventually, of course, the Mail on Sunday released the silver bullet, and he could no longer deny it. There was irrefutable evidence. And then he held his hand up and he said, maybe I was mistaken. And then he claims that he was doing it to protect BP. Well, it of course did accelerate his departure from BP, and there were calls, obviously not least by the Mail on Sunday, for him to be charged with perjury. But no court case was ever initiated. So I'm sure there was some kind of settlement outside of court, but anybody else who lied before a High Court judge for 2 weeks would have been charged with perjury, and of course it's an open and shut case. But here, nothing. Lord John Brown escapes that. So here we've got a guy who, in his tenure at the helm of BP, had been predatory in terms of acquisition, but he'd been mercenary and cavalier in terms of the way he ran these businesses by promoting this mantra of profit above all else. So having left BP under a cloud, obviously because of the revelations in the Mail on Sunday and the subsequent 2 weeks of perjury, the guy then sat on the bench, making megabucks as a consultant. Well, he re-emerges 2 years later, or nearly 3 years later, when David Cameron comes into office, because David Cameron appoints him to a government position. Now this is almost sort of like US presidential appointment. In the US, the president of the country has the authority to appoint whomever he so wishes around him in the various offices. They don't have to have had any experience in politics whatsoever. I mean, in most cases they do, but they don't have to. If he wants to bring somebody in from the corporate world or from the military, he can do so. In the UK, our tradition is that the people on the cabinet are at least elected. They are elected individuals, and okay, you can argue that that somewhat restricts the talent pool, but nonetheless, it generally works. But here, David Cameron appoints BP Chief John Brown, controversial choice for super director post, get this, intended to inject business ethos into government. Business ethos. From a guy whose corporate record left a body count that even might make the Clintons blush, and of course questions over not only his personal life, no real issue there perhaps, but the fact that his integrity has to be called into question because the guy clearly does not respect the legal process and certainly doesn't respect the oath of truth. Well, it gets better. The fracking industry, the shale gas extraction in this country, had been on hold since May of 2011. The reason being was because in England, 2 wells had been drilled two exploratory wells into the shale gas in the Bowland Shale on the Fylde Peninsula in Lancashire, on the outskirts of Blackpool. And these two wells had been fracked. Now, I'm going to explain the fracking process in a second. I can assure you at the end of the evening, you will know more about fracking than almost anyone sitting in the House of Commons. And I know that because well, not everyone, I haven't spoken to everyone, but those that I have looked at their websites, it's very clear that they have no clue other than what they've been told to spiel out. But those two wells that were fracked on the Fylde Peninsula in early 2011, in both cases they resulted in seismic events, i.e. small earthquakes. Now the first one was about 1.5 on the Richter scale, and that occurred on April the 1st, 2011. And a lot of people thought that it was, when they read it in the local paper, that it was just a delayed April Fool's joke. Well, the second one was a little stronger. It was 2.3 on the Richter scale, and that occurred in the middle of May. And the only things that had happened in the area to possibly cause this was the two frack jobs run by Quadrilla. So an immediate moratorium was put on the process of drilling and fracking, pending further investigation, because this was something that was going to be unleashed on a much larger scale, and two exploratory wells, two earthquakes, might have some significant ramifications. Well, I must confess that I actually took my eye off the ball a bit after that, because I thought, that's great, we've had two earthquakes, that's it, it's done, it's dusted. Well, in November of last year, this guy goes to the media and states that he will do everything in his power to ensure that Britain is at the centre of the shale gas revolution. So this guy's not an elected representative of the government. There's a moratorium in place at the time. But here's the guy who's the business ethos advisor, standing up and saying basically that he is going to do everything he possibly can to ensure that Britain is at the heart of the shale gas revolution. And then 1 month later, on December the 14th, David Cameron announces that the moratorium is lifted, and basically looking at the various regulations they need to put in place, but bottom line is Britain is going to participate in the shale gas revolution. Well, the company that was responsible for the drilling and fracking in the Fylde Peninsula was this company, Quadrilla Resources. Now, all the companies, and I'll mention some of the names, I don't expect you to remember them because they're not household names. They are not companies that will just roll off your tongue, because the oil industry has learned from past experience that if you have a company that everyone knows, then there's a lot more focus on it. And I'll share with you in a second something that happened in Ireland that really puts that into perspective. So here it's all small companies that are on pioneer duty, if you like. These are the companies that have been tasked with being the pioneers to establish the viability of shale gas and coal bed methane extraction in this country. Well, Quadrilla is actually partially owned by a company called Coastal Oil and Gas. And guess what? This guy is the chairman of Coastal Oil and Gas. So here, talk about business ethos. Here's the guy effectively insider trading. Insider trading. Chairman of Coastal, which has interests in some of the other pioneer companies. So of course, those companies, the share price of those companies and the share prices of Coastal will go stratospheric once the moratorium, well, the moratorium is lifted, but once these guys get their bits in the ground, start fracking and start producing gas. So this guy is not exactly a disinterested third party. I mean, you can't see all this, but I mean, the guy's connections are well, very, very significant. But that shouldn't really be any surprise, because his mentor when he was at BP was this guy. This is a guy called Peter Sutherland. an Irishman by accident of birth. But in fact, he was the youngest Attorney General in the Irish government at the time, in his day. And that was the start of his political career. Now, the role of Attorney General is to make sure that the government of the day upholds the law and respects the Constitution. But this guy was clearly in that job to learn how to undermine the Irish Constitution. And when this guy was interviewed by the BBC last year in June, he stated categorically that his vision is the abolition and eradication of the nation state and of a world governed by the corporations. He makes no secret about it at all. Well, this guy's connectivity is very significant. Let me just introduce you to a few of his connections. There was the youngest Attorney General. After he left the Irish government, he went to Europe, to Brussels, and became an unelected EU Commissioner. Whilst he was in the role of EU Commissioner, he chaired the GATT talks. Now, he was still in his mid-40s at the time, which the GATT talks was the General Agreement on Trade Tariffs. And immediately after that, he was appointed to the World Trade Organization. In fact, he was the founding Director General of the World Trade Organization in 1994. He's also been chairman of Allied Irish Banks. He's not only a member of the Trilateral Commission, which is, of course, the Rockefeller global think tank. He is the chairman of the European branch of the Trilateral Commission. Former chairman of BP. He was on the board of Royal Bank of Scotland when it collapsed. In fact, it was this guy who, when he was chairing the Remuneration Committee for Royal Bank of Scotland, it was this guy who was literally proposing the outrageous packages that Fred Goodwin was getting whilst he was effectively asleep at the wheel and the bank was collapsing. When the bank was taken into public ownership, when it collapsed, of course Peter Southern was asked to leave the board, but he took a fairly chunky payoff at the same time. And he's also been chairman of Goldman Sachs International. Now that's just some of the connections of this guy. But let me show you another chart. You're not going to be able to read this, but you're going to get the picture. You're going to get the idea here. And you can find this on the web, and if you want to sort of explore it, you just need to sort of keep running your screen around it. But what this is every member of the Bilderberger meeting in 2009. And here is Peter Sutherland. Now, anybody who tells you that the Bilderberger meetings are just a lunch club of random individuals selected to sort of come along and chew the cud for a few days, well, they're just delusional. I mean, this here shows you the incestuous connectivity of all of the people that attend the Bilderberger meetings. And of course, these guys are invited to attend because they are so well connected. And the purpose of the Bilderberger meeting is to give these guys their marching orders for the coming year. Because of these guys' connections, they are expected that every single decision that they have the opportunity to participate in will further the global corporatist agenda, i.e. the global government under the control of the corporations. So this is the guy who trained John Brown in his global corporatism. So now here we go, John Brown, the guy who took BP to global predominance in the oil industry, and now this is the guy driving the shale gas agenda at the heart of British government. But let's have a look at what this is all about now. Now I'm going to show you a very simplistic graphic which really has very little relationship to what's going to be going on in the UK. But the reason I'm showing it to you is because this is what MPs and MEPs have got on their websites. It's like, let's oversimplify this so that we can delude the public into thinking that it's all safe, it's all simple, and they've got nothing to worry about. So what you see here in this very simplistic graphic is a vertical well. I mean, let me just make the observation, there's no such thing as a vertical well, a truly vertical well, because the motor on the drill bit, as it descends, it drags the drill string in a gentle spiral. That's why the cementing of the casing is so important. What you see down here is the vertical well, and then instead of just being perforated, because when you're going into conventional geology or a conventional reservoir and you're sinking a conventional well, you sink the casing, you secure the casing from the surrounding geology by the cement process, and then you perforate the well. In other words, you blast holes into the casing of the cement, so you create a pathway for the oil or the gas that is contained within that geological strata to come into the well and, of course, migrate to the surface. And it does that because in a natural reservoir, a conventional reservoir, then the oil or the gas is under natural pressure, and once you open the well, it will be forced up the well because that's the path of least resistance. But shale gas and coal bed methane is not found in conventional geology. It's found in what's called tight geology. There's a pretty good description, because what that means is that it's not naturally porous. So if you simply sink a well into tight geology, you perforate the casing, you might get a dribble, if you're lucky, because there's no natural pressure, there's not enough natural pressure to force it to the surface. So what you've got to do is you've got to create artificial porosity by fracturing the geology. And what this overly simplistic graphic is supposed to show is that the geology has been opened up, and as it's opened up, it's kept open with sand that's in the frac fluid, and then once that's opened, then hey presto, the oil or the gas moves to the surface. But like I said, that bears no relationship whatsoever to the reality. It's a pathetic graphic, but that's the one that you'll find on the websites of various MPs and MEPs. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a short animation. Now this is an animation from a Canadian gas company, but it's one of the best that I've seen in terms of explaining the actual process of drilling and then perforating and fracturing a horizontal well for the sole purpose of extracting shale gas from tight geology. And this will enable us to understand the process and for you to start seeing some of the concerns that we have here. And then after the break, we're going to actually look at some video footage from the US and from Australia that will be irrefutable evidence to show the magnitude of the concerns that I had. And by the way, the video footage I'm going to show you, the politicians and the oil industry denies exists. This is the only way they can deal with it. It's called institutional denial. You just keep denying in the hope that the vast majority of people will believe their denial and won't look for themselves. Now you're going to have to sort of forgive the commentator, because the commentator, of course, is loading the superlatives like how wonderful the process is, how clean the energy, etc., etc. Forget all that. The real significance here is the actual drilling and fracking process.
Natural gas from the Utica Shale is a clean and efficient energy source that is abundant in the St. Lawrence lowlands of Quebec. Let's take a look at the horizontal drilling and stimulation processes that have made shale gas exploration so successful. A drill bit is mounted on the end of the drill pipe. As the bit grinds away, a mixture of water and additives called mud is pumped into the hole to cool the bit and flush the cuttings to the surface. The mud cakes on the walls of the wellbore, keeping it intact and preventing invasion of drilling mud into the surrounding rock formation. The hole is drilled below the deepest freshwater zone or aquifer near the surface. The drill pipe and bit are removed. Surface casing is then inserted into the drilled hole to isolate the freshwater aquifers. Once cemented, it serves as a foundation for the blowout preventer, a safety device that connects the rig to the well bore. Cement is pumped down the casing and out through the opening of the shoe at the bottom of the casing. It is then forced up between the casing and the hole, permanently sealing off the well bore from the fresh water. Once the blowout preventers are installed, the pipe and bit are lowered back down the hole to drill through the plug and cement, and continue the vertical section of the well to approximately 300 meters above the planned horizontal leg. This depth is called the kickoff point, where the curve will begin so that the horizontal section can be drilled. Up to this point, the process is the same as drilling a vertical well. Again, the pipe and bit are pulled out of the hole, and a downhole drilling motor with measurement well drilling instruments is lowered back into the hole to begin the angle building process. The distance to make the curve from the kickoff point to where the well bore becomes horizontal is typically just under 300 meters. Once the curve is completed, drilling begins on the well's horizontal section called the lateral. The pipe used to drill the well measures 9 meters in length, and each length weighs approximately 224 kilograms. It takes over 350 pieces of pipe, weighing nearly 79 tons, to drill a 3,200 meter well. At various stages of drilling, the pipe is taken out of the hole for tool and bit changes and put back in. This process is called tripping pipe. When the targeted distance is reached, the drill pipe and bit are removed from the well bore one last time. Production casing is now inserted into the full length of the well bore. Cement is again pumped down the casing and out through the hole in the casing shoe, forcing the cement up between the casing and the wall of the hole, filling the open space known as the annulus. Casing the well is a very important process because it permanently secures the well bore, and it prevents hydrocarbons and other fluids from seeping out into the formation as they are brought to the surface. At this point, the drilling rig is no longer needed. A temporary wellhead is installed, and the location is prepared for the service crew, who will perf, frack, and prepare the well for production. The first of these steps is to perf or perforate the casing. A perforating gun is inserted into the casing to the targeted section of the horizontal leg. An electrical current is sent down the wire line to the perf gun and sets up a charge that shoots small holes through the casing and cement.
Now at this point, this is a conventional well. Okay, if this was in a normal geology, a normal hydrocarbon bearing geology, you drill into the geology and you open the well via the perforation process. A conventional well, and I would have no real problem with that. It's the next stage that is the problem.
And out a short distance into the shale formation. The perf gun is then pulled out of the hole. Next, because shale is tight or compressed, the well will have to be fracked. Known as hydraulic fracturing, this is a process where water, sand, and additives are pumped into the wellbore and down the casing under extremely high pressure. Water and sand make up over 99% of this frac fluid. The remainder consists of compounds commonly found in consumer products. As the mixture is forced out through the perforations and into the surrounding rock, pressure causes the shale to fracture. This creates a pathway connecting the reservoir to the well and allows the gas to flow to the well bore. Next, a temporary plug is used to close off or isolate the perforated and fracked section of the well bore, so that the next stages of the horizontal leg can be perforated and fracked.
Now, in this wonderful animation, what we've seen here is the perfect frac job. Because what we've seen here is the frac fluid literally fractures just this strata of geology. And the fractures stop very nicely and conveniently just before the edge of this particular geological strata. So in this illustration, if this occurred in reality, it should be reasonable to assume that 100% of what you've pumped down the hole should be recoverable, plus of course the debris from the fractures here. But now let's put a few things in perspective, because in the first instance, no geologist, no petroleum engineer and no chemist can absolutely guarantee how much of the geology is going to actually be fractured. Consequently, it's actually considered to be an outstanding frac job if 50% of what is pumped down the hole is recovered. But let's start putting a few things into perspective here. Anyone got any idea how much water it takes to run a drilling and frac job? Yep, millions. Millions of gallons. In fact, there was a record set in Michigan a few weeks ago where a single well to be drilled and fractured took 21 million gallons of water. They're going to frack another one in a few weeks close by that's going to take 16 million gallons of water. But the average is about 4 million. But let's assume that the wells here are going to be less than demand and consume less than the average. So let's assume that they require 2 million gallons of water. But what you've seen here is a single horizontal section. The reality is that from each vertical section there will probably be 8 horizontal sections going off of that. So we are looking at potentially 16 million gallons of water being consumed into the well, of which only a half would be recoverable. But once it is converted into a frac fluid, it's no longer water. Although the oil industry loosely calls it water, or water rich is actually the term they use, water rich, but that's like saying rat poison is sugar rich. In the commentary you heard that the frac fluid is 99.5% water and sand. The reality is it's more likely 95% water and sand and 5% additives. And the commentator also said the additives are just normal products found in domestic products. Well, you know, paint thinner is a domestic product. Paint thinners contain xylenes. Xylenes are illegal to be put down the drain. So in other words, if you're using paint thinner in the house, it is illegal to pour the paint thinner down the drain because the breakdown of xylenes is nigh on impossible. Not, it just takes thousands of years. So it's illegal, yet it's a normal household product. So this is, again, this is how they use the language to obfuscate, to deceive, to keep people thinking that there's nothing to worry about. Now let's, again, put it in perspective. It's 5%. 5% of 2 million gallons. 5% of 2 million gallons? I think it's about 100,000. 100,000 gallons of additive. So we're not talking a beaker full, we're talking a significant chunk. Now, in the US, they are draining the Great Lakes. They are using the water out of the Great Lakes because to frack, you must use fresh water. You cannot use salt water because the salt is abrasive and it creates friction. And obviously, one of the nicknames for a frac fluid is slip water because you want to be able to pump it down hole without any loss of pressure. You want as much pressure at the bottom as you're pumping at the top. So it has to be fresh water. In Australia, they are sucking the Great Artesian Basin dry. The Great Artesian Basin is estimated to need 85 billion gallons of water a year just to naturally replenish. But the Australian government has authorised the extraction companies, the gas companies and the mining companies, to remove 500 billion gallons of water a year from the Great Artesian Basin. That is 6 times the amount that it needs to naturally replenish. So in the US they have the Great Lakes and they have the Great Rivers. And of course they have a very thinly, densely populated country compared to the UK. The same with Australia. They have the Great Artesian Basin, but it's also a very thinly populated country, apart from obviously the city areas. This country is not thinly populated. To put it in perspective, Colorado, which is right at the forefront of the shale gas industry in the US, Colorado is just a little bit more than twice the size of England. Yet it has a population of 1/10 that of England. So England is 20 times more densely populated than Colorado. And we're going to look at some of the effects of the fracking industry on that thinly populated population in Colorado and also in northern New Mexico. The other critical issue here, and I'm going to share with you one of the outrageous pieces of obfuscation that was presented at a public meeting in Bath by the Chief Executive Officer of one of the pioneer companies, UK Methane, which has as one of its owners Coastal Oil and Gas, whose chairman is Lord John Brown. The chairman of UK Methane, which is a Bridgend-based company in South Wales, is a Welshman by the name of Gerwyn Llewellyn-Williams. And in the public meeting in Bath, he made this observation. He said, yeah, you know, I hear all the concerns about the water consumption in the fracking process, but for each frack job, we're not using any more water than it takes to water a golf course for a month. But he's missing a key element here. You know, I lived in Dubai when they were building the amazing Emirates golf course, literally out of the desert. And these guys obviously were oil rich, and they called in the best drainage engineers they could get to design the drainage system for the Emirates golf course. And they pride themselves that 80% of the water that they pump onto the golf course is actually recycled through their drainage system.
Las Vegas is the same.
It makes sense. Yeah, it makes sense, especially in a desert area. The issue with the frac fluid is that once you've mixed those chemicals with it, it's lost to the system. It's gone. So, you know, when we think about how we normally use water, you know, even when we're drinking it, it's never lost to the system, one way or another. Even with their industrial processes, every effort is made to purify the water and return it to the system. With the frac fluids, much more difficult. You know, in the US, they've used a horrendous system called evaporation pits, which is literally lifting the produced water, it's called, another misnomer, the produced water, the used frac fluid, and pumping it into a plastic-lined pit right next door to the well. And then what they do is they put a pump motor in the middle of the pit to create like a spray. You think, oh, that's nice, a fountain. But the purpose of the spray is to accelerate the evaporation process. And when you look at the health impacts of the people that live downwind of those evap pits, it ain't a pretty sight. Now, in Europe, if they actually start fracking, they're not going to use evap pits. So when I met with the Quadrilla management team on the 1st of February of this year, and I asked the Chief Executive Officer what the plan was for the produced water, he basically said, we're still working on it. The short-term plan is to put the produced water into double-skinned tanks whilst they think about it. Well, the company that actually purified the produced water from the first 2 frac jobs has actually declined to tender for any future business. Now that speaks volumes. Now what happened to the produced water from the first 2 frac jobs? Well, there's a Manchester-based company who did the purification, and then it was pumped into the Manchester Ship Canal, and as far as I understand, without any third-party oversight. So we are totally reliant on the integrity of the company in Manchester when they declare that, yeah, it was purified before we pumped it into the Manchester Ship Canal. Now, when I was with the Quadrilla management team, I was particularly interested in one of the individuals, a guy called Mark Miller, because he actually used to work for my former company, Schlumberger. Now, I didn't know him when he worked there because he left the company in 1986. He worked in the US with Schlumberger, with Dow Schlumberger. I didn't go to the US until 1994. But you know, I knew that we would know some of the same people because, you know, in the US organisation, a lot of the people in Schlumberger had been there for, you know, basically since they left college. And this guy was standing talking to a group of local residents And in response to one of the residents' questions, who asked him, he said, you know, what happens when frack fluid contaminates the water supply? And this guy turned round and said, there has never been a proven case. You've got to love the terminology. There has never been a proven case of frack fluids contaminating groundwater. And I have to tell you, at this point, I did actually sort of lose it a bit. Because it's just an outright lie. And I knew it was a lie. And I think I just said something like, you what? And I said, look, you know, why did you make that statement? Because I said this gentleman can actually go home and sit at his computer, and within about 3.5 nanoseconds, he can come up with evidence that frack fluids have contaminated water. And what he said was really incredible. He said, listen very carefully. He said, what I said is, there's never been a proven case. And, well, what he's really hanging his hat on, I think, is a piece of legislation that was introduced in 2005 by somebody who you might recognise, Uncle Dick Cheney, former Chief Executive Officer of Halliburton, between 1995 and 2000, when he was, of course, sworn in on the White House lawn as Vice President. By the way, he was actually still on the Halliburton payroll for the duration of his Vice Presidency. But he wasn't allowed to take the salary, it was put into trust for him. But ostensibly, he's still on the payroll. And in 2005, this guy introduced what is known as the Halliburton loophole. All you've got to Google is Halliburton loophole. And you'll find a whole bunch of articles written on this. But this is when Congress passed the Energy Policy Act, the controversial clause that excluded nearly everything used in fracking from being regulated by the US Environmental Protection Agency. Well, in addition, Cheney ensured that the oil and gas industry was exempted from the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act. So when you're exempt from everything, yeah, how's anybody ever going to prove that, you know, because all the various agencies effectively close ranks. And I'll show you how they do that a bit later. But they close ranks and cover up their respective fellow corporate crimes. It is truly, truly outrageous. And forgive me, you know, when Mark Miller says, oh, but you know, you don't worry, because this is Europe, this is England. Yeah, the regulatory bodies in England are much more stringent than in the US. Well, first of all, we don't really have any regulatory bodies yet. They're being set up because we now have the Department of Energy, Climate Change, and Unconventional Gas and Oil. So the Department of, or the Office of Unconventional Gas and Oil is really just sort of starting to find its feet. But can anybody remember the last time that the water supply in this country was accidentally polluted? Yes, it was, absolutely. Do you remember when it was?
1980.
Very good, it's 1988. 1988, and what happened at Camelford in Cornwall was that a tanker driver was delivering a tanker load of concentrated aluminium sulfate, which I think is used to deal with algae in the water supply. Anyway, it's used in the water supply in absolutely microscopic quantities. I mean, 20,000 gallons would last you for years. Anyway, this guy was delivering this tanker load. When he turned up at the pumping station in Camelford, it was unmanned. So he phoned the local office of South West Water, or whatever it was they were called at the time, and they told him where to find the key, which was under a rock by the gate. The only problem was that this key fitted every damn tank in the pumping station, and this guy inadvertently pumped concentrated aluminium sulfate directly into the local water supply. Now, funnily enough, the local residents noticed it immediately because it stank to high heaven, and it tasted like... So they were calling the office to ask for advice, what was going on here. And do you know what the response was? Mix it with orange juice and hold your nose. And you'll be fine. Well, anybody got any idea when it was that the British government finally admitted that there had indeed been a serious accidental contamination of the Camelford water supply? It was 2010. And credit where credit's due, It was actually due to a 3-year campaign by the Daily Mail. I mean, not running articles every day, but just digging up more and more evidence to show that not only had there been a contamination, but there'd been a cover-up. So for 23 years, the contamination was covered up by institutional denial. Provided nobody ever breaks ranks and actually admits that there was a problem, then you can just keep denying that there was a problem. Well, eventually, the Daily Mail had presented enough evidence so that there had to be an admission, and I guess they decided after 23 years, well, okay, so what? I mean, it's estimated that some 20,000 people suffered in some way, shape or form. It's not known if anybody actually died because of it, because no one was looking for it. Because officially, there was no contamination. So, forgive me if I don't exactly have a lot of confidence in British regulatory authorities who will close ranks, especially when a guy like Lord John Brown is at the heart of government. They'll close ranks and just deny that there's any problem. Anyway, on that note, let's take a break, because we'll take a short break. Let's try and do it in 15 minutes, if we can. Oh, it takes you that long to walk to the bar and back, doesn't it? Anyway, if we can do it in 15, great. We'll see how close we get. And then when we come back, we're actually going to start to take a look at the effects caused by fracking and the issues of 50% of the frack fluid actually disappearing into the geology. And we'll look at what the damage that 50% can do and the effects that can come from it. Okay? Thanks very much. We're going to show you some actual footage from Australia. Now, none of the footage I'm going to show you from Australia is older than November 25th last year. And the reason that Australia is important is because the area that's been fracked in Australia, which is really northern New South Wales, southern Queensland, has only been fracked for the last 2.5, 3 years. So this is what happens in a relatively short space of time. When we start to look at the US, it's been going on for closer to 2 decades. But the reason Australia is so significant is because this has happened so quickly. Now, the guy that you're going to see in the video is a guy called Brian Monk. Now, 3 years ago, this guy, by his own admission, was your archetypal average Aussie. He was just interested in a chilled life. Crack a tube of Foster's, throw a shrimp on the barbie, and he bought 5,000 acres in southern Queensland with a view that he and his son were going to start farming it, and then basically his son was going to manage it, and he was going to just live a life of relaxed luxury. Then the gas industry moved in. Now, Brian has 5,000 acres. There is no gas infrastructure on his property at all. Okay, so there's no rigs, no pads, nothing on his property, but they're all around him. And his property is part of what has been licensed. And in fact, the property is divided between 2 of the gas companies. Now, they don't have to tell him that they're drilling under his property. Because in Australia, in the UK, and in much of the US, the law is based on split estate. This is the legal term, split estate. It's also the name of an excellent documentary that I will reference again a bit later and show you a short clip from. Split estate refers to the fact that the owner of the land owns the surface and just about enough to maybe grow a carrot and a potato. But woe betide you if you find any gold or silver in that top layer, because that's owned by the Crown. And hydrocarbons are owned by the state. So split estate, where you have split estate, the owner, in theory, still controls right of access to the land. But the British government's actually thought about that already, and in the US they thought about that too. But in Australia at the moment, there is still the power to control right of access. But because of the capacity for horizontal drilling, it doesn't mean to say they ain't going to be drilling under your property. So we don't know for sure that the gas companies have drilled under Brian's property. I mean, we can assume they have, but we don't know for sure. But what you're going to see is evidence or the impact of drilling within the vicinity. Now, in the first clip here, Brian and his son, Barry, and his wife are sitting on the veranda around the table. It's a nice day, it's the end of November, it's the end of the dry season, there's a gentle breeze, and there's a gas detector on the middle of the table. The gas detector detects 10 non-indigenous gases. So in a normal environment, the gas detector would be silent. It's picking up 10 non-indigenous gases. Now we don't know what, we can't tell from this particular gas detector what those gases are, but most likely we're talking methane, because that's what's being mined, coal bed methane from the area.
No comment.
10 gases.
That's unbelievable. That is actually scary. That's. Well, that didn't help, Kathy. You stopped it from clicking.
Well, that's just to say that
we're safe here now, is it?
I've pushed it your way more. There we go, it's come back, still in the air. I'm just sort of trying to press fresh air through it.
Well, not from cow farts.
Koala farts.
Not
So
koala
is this
farts.
methane
cow burps.
only?
No.
Oh.
10 gases. No comment.
Is there a list
no
of
comment.
10 gases?
That's unbelievable.
In the next clip, Brian and his son have moved about 100 yards away from the house. Like I said, it's the end of the dry season, so the ground is really hard baked. Okay, so just take a look at what happens when they break the surface.
Against it, no reading. We've got a bit of a breeze blowing today. Okay, bring in the workforce. And we've got quite a deflection. I don't know whether the camera can pick that up.
So we can.
So what's happened is that the fracking process has opened up the tight geology, and because the frac fluid is aggressive, that 50% of the frac fluid that's lost down the hole just keeps on going. It just keeps looking for the path of least resistance. And of course it's aggressive, it's got acids in it, it's deliberately designed to eat away at the rock. So it will just keep on going until it finds, well, the path of least resistance. And eventually either ends up in the water table, or it just sort of percolates through into geology that has a natural porosity, and then the gas will start to migrate to the surface. And of course we're talking an odourless gas. That's why the miners used to take canaries down the pits before the daily safety lamp was invented. You know, when the canary started to get agitated, that was the time to turn and go in the other direction. And if the canary did an impersonation of a Norwegian blue, you know, it's time to hightail it out of there. The next clip is Brian and his son driving down to a well located just outside a community called Tara. They've got the AC, the air conditioning off in the car, so they've just got the vents open and it's just the natural air, the outside air, coming into the vehicle as they drive down. And the gas detector is sitting on the dashboard. picture. So consequently, I mean, basically they are driving through a contaminated environment. And you can't smell it. Now, in the British media, part of the propaganda that's being put out, this is from the Mail on Sunday on March 24th of this year. Double-page spread, how gas gold mine under this pasture could help Osborne end debt nightmare. Well, I'm not going to read you the whole 2 pages of bullshit. Just the first 2 paragraphs. But you'll get the picture. As you approach ground zero of Britain's potential shale gas bonanza and alight next to a 10,000-foot deep hole dug 5 miles east of Blackpool, your nostrils are suddenly assailed by the overwhelming smell of methane. An odourless gas. At first, you think there must be some catastrophic failure of a gas pipe deep below, and you wonder if the fracking revolution really can be the answer to keeping the lights on and Britain's houses warm. But the smell, it turns out, has nothing to do with the drilling of a gas well 2 miles below Lancashire farmland. The villains are cows in the neighbouring field, making their own very distinctive contribution to greenhouse gases. Well, at least the author didn't go to the lengths that the Mail on Sunday went in September of 2009, when they ran a double-page spread making the proposition that Britain's dairy and beef herds should be culled because cow farts were contributing so significantly to global warming. Now, I've got to tell you, sometimes I read these articles and I wonder if the author has their tongue sort of firmly planted in their cheek, because they think that surely people are going to see through this. Surely they'll see I'm being satirical. But of course the reality is, even if that was the intention, the vast majority of people don't. They read it exactly at face value. And of course, to maintain the propaganda, actually this was the day before, this appeared the day before that article. And this was when we went into that cold snap. Could we face gas rationing? And then the Monday headline was 36 hours away from running out of gas. Of course we weren't. Not a chance in hell. In fact, on the same day that they ran that headline, a guy called Sam Laidlaw, Chief Executive Officer of Centrica, which owns British Gas, was awarded a £4 million bonus. Now the reason he got such a bonus was because, you know, these guys, they may not think like we do. You know, their primary motivation is this. But at the same time, they're not stupid. And guys like Sam Laidlaw, you know, they have contingency plans on contingency plans on contingency plans on contingency plans. That's what they're paid for. That's what they get the big bucks for. To make sure that the country is never going to be in a situation where it runs out of gas. You know, not only have we got enormous reserves, primarily under the oceans, I mean in storage. You know, this is gas that's been mined and then it's put into storage in massive salt caverns under the North Sea and also under the Irish Sea. But then we've got pipelines coming in from Norway, from the Netherlands, from Belgium and from France. And by the way, the gas isn't ours anyway. The Treaty of Lisbon makes that very, very clear. We are simply, effectively, the miners of that gas, and we get to use, you know, what it is that we need. But the EU effectively has first dibs on all EU resources. So if there's a problem anywhere else and it's deemed that the UK has to cough up, that's it. That's it. Under the Treaty of Lisbon, we have given away the sovereignty of our national resources. So it's a bit of a misleading presentation in the media anyway. Anyway, back to the videos. Because the other thing is that the gas industry, the shale gas industry says, no, we don't contaminate water. There's no evidence. There's absolutely no evidence of methane migrating into water supplies. And methane's always been in water, which is actually true. It's always been in water, not all water, but some water. It's always been there, in microscopic quantities. And this is why, really, what we need now is we need surveys on water quality and soil quality and air quality, so that we have a baseline, so that if they do start this, and I hope to God they don't, but if they do start this, we've got a baseline. Because otherwise they are simply going to claim that that was there anyway. Well, there's two types of methane anyways. There's the biomethane, which is the stuff that is naturally in the water in relatively microscopic quantities. And then there's the thermomethane, which is basically that which migrates from the gas fields that are fracked, and that's what migrates up through the geology into the water supply. This is from the end of last year, and this is Brian, the same guy we just seen, Brian Monk. This is him running water from his water bore into a vessel, and then he has literally rigged up a device to establish whether or not there is methane content in that water.
Okay, this is our rig up to prove that the government's been lying to us about there being no gas in this water bore. This water bore has now been running for a few minutes, and as you can see, it's burning gas. This would be the gas that the government maintains isn't present, that the Queensland scientists at a couple of laboratories have said there's no gas in this water bore. So every Queenslander can feel quite confident in the fact that the government's tested these gas bores and said that there's no leakage. They can be so confident that they're probably corrupt or lying. Corrupt, lying and incompetent, one or the, it's got to be something. Yep.
We've got BG Group, QGC, on one side of our property and Origin Energy on the other side. Their coal seam gas tenements divide our property in two. We do not have any coal seam gas infrastructure on our property, or so we thought, but this flame is coming from the water from our registered stock and domestic water bore.
I think that is the most damning. It's not a huge amount of gas, but it is so damning because it's there all the time.
Both coal seam gas companies have been heavily extracting water from the aquifers under us, leaving us with very little water and more gas.
That was funny.
It's a good job Brian has a sense of humour, I tell you. Well, after they had been down to the rig at Tara, where they were driving when the gas detector was on the dashboard, when they got home that night, Brian's son, Barry, started to feel very unwell. In fact, he started to slur his words, hadn't been drinking, started to slur his words, and then he basically lost all coherence. Anyway, then he managed to sort of say he was going to go to bed, and as he got up, his leg buckled from under him. So they called an ambulance, and he was taken to hospital, and he was kept in hospital, you know, under observation for a few days. And then they dismissed him from hospital, they released him from hospital, claiming it was calcium deficiency. Calcium deficiency. Methane is a neuroinhibitor. So one of the symptoms of getting methane into the body. I mean, obviously, if you get it in excessive quantities, you're going to be asphyxiated because it's going to force the oxygen out. But if you're taking it in relatively small quantities on a consistent basis, then, like all things, not everyone is susceptible in the same way. But there's little doubt that Barry's symptoms were related to an overdose, effectively, of methane. Methane has the neuroinhibitors. It also contains DNA disruptors and endocrine disruptors. In the film Split Estate, which is a documentary that was released in 2009, I'm sure some of you have heard of the film Gasland. Yeah? Okay, well, Gasland is a good documentary. And it was made by a young man by the name of Josh Fox, who had an interesting plot of land, a beautiful parcel of land, actually, in Pennsylvania, over here. And he was offered, in 2008, he was offered $100,000 by a gas company for open access onto his property. Well, at the time, he really wasn't that familiar with the gas industry, but he realised that you don't get offered $100,000 for nothing. So being a smart guy, he decided that he would take a road trip and start to investigate, you know, what had occurred in the gas lands over here in Colorado and in New Mexico and in Texas and here in Oklahoma. And what he saw absolutely shocked him. So he made the documentary Gasland. Well, Split Estate actually predates Gasland. Of course, the Split Estate doesn't roll off the tongue like Gasland does. So Gasland is the documentary that sort of got into the, if you like, the popular consciousness. But Split Estate predates Gasland, and in my opinion is a better documentary. And it focuses on the communities in this area here, western Colorado and northwestern New Mexico. And particularly on a community up here is the community of a town called Rifle, who have had the gas rigs in their area for close on 20 years. And what you will see is, of course, people naturally want, especially if they were born and raised in an area. I mean, in the US, you know, you've got something like 75% of people who live in many of these states have never been outside their states. You know, I think there's only 19% of Americans who have passports. But, you know, many of them never go outside their state because, I mean, when you take into account, I say that this is twice the size of England. You know, they've got everything they need. So these people, and many of them live on land that, you know, was first farmed by their descendants who came over on the wagon trains. And so they have an existential attachment to that property. And so they don't want to leave it, despite the fact that basically it's just becoming more and more uninhabitable. And because the gas industry doesn't have to report any contamination, if the gas industry learns that somebody has had their water supply contaminated, then they will come along and put a big buffalo tank outside the property. Not because they've admitted any liability, they're just being neighbourly. But woe betide anybody who kicks up about the quality of their water, because if they do, and they start pointing the finger at the gas company, then they're going to find the buffalo tank disappears. And then, of course, they're once again reliant on, you know, the wellbore water. And what you would see if you watch the film Split Estate, and it is up on YouTube at the moment, it goes up and down, it's on a German website at the moment. So if you see Split Estate and you see the German text alongside, but the film, of course, is in English. And in that documentary, you will see that there's a particular family that are focused on, and the husband doesn't appear to have suffered, you know, unduly, but the wife has gone into early dementia. And of course the oil industry says, oh, it's nothing to do with us, it's just one of those things, these things happen. But there's a lady called Dr. Theo Colborn, who's regarded as one of the world's leading specialists on endocrine disruption, and she's certainly of the opinion that this is the type of symptom that you can expect to see on an increasing basis of people who are exposed to contaminated water. And of course, it's not just drinking it, you're washing in it. You're washing your clothes in it, you're washing your crockery and your cutlery in it. So, you know, the toxicity may not appear to be excessive. It's not going to make you sick. It's not like, you don't have to mix it with orange juice and hold your nose. But it's just chipping away. You know, in fact, it's far more pernicious because, you know, over a period of a decade or 2 decades, that's when it's really going to start to bite. So let's just have a look at this, a short clip from the documentary Split Estate. Now, what you're going to see is you're going to see a representative of the Colorado Oil and Gas Association. And of course, the people in the Oil and Gas Associations, they're effectively the community representatives, but they wouldn't be doing those jobs if they weren't apologists for the gas industry. And you're going to see one particular Stepford wife, and listen to how she easily dismisses, you know, the fracking process and justifies the fact that the gas companies do not have to declare the recipe for the frack fluid. This is part of the problem, that there is no transparency whatsoever in what is being pumped down hole.
We have a very large emphasis with our 325 member companies about being a good neighbor, about talking to people, about doing the things that you would do in your neighborhood with your next door neighbor.
When they were doing this pump jack, I wasn't home at the time. And anyway, they brought in this huge rig to put that machine on there. They had already agreed several years before to fence off the old cemetery. My great-grandfather is buried here, and his son, Filomeno Armenta, who probably died about 1914. When I came down, I saw the porta potty. The porta potty was, I said, well, they kind of put the porta potties a little bit too close. And there was a huge pile of gravel right on top of the cemetery. First thing, when we saw it, we were in shock. The markers were sandstone, and one of the markers was an old cedar post. And I haven't been able to locate the cedar post or what the heck they did with it. I don't know if they hauled it off as trash. They totally wiped out the cemetery. At my own expense, I came in and I put this pipe fence to make sure they don't do it again. When I put this fence up, they sent me a letter telling me they're going to sue me. They wanted me to furnish proof that it was there. They have reneged on protecting the cemetery as they promised. And now I don't know where none of the markers are.
In the U.S. and the lower 48 onshore, the boom that is currently going on is driven a lot by technology. There have been a lot of technological advances with horizontal drilling, with fracture stimulation.
One of the key elements to finding and getting the resource out of very tight sand or hard rock is a fracking process. Fracking is just a short word for fracturing.
Hydraulic fracturing, or fracking as it's commonly called, is a drilling technique first commercialized by Halliburton in 1949.
It comes in with very high-powered water and sand and a slightly soapy mixture. And all it does is it goes down and it just fractures little tiny fractures in the rock. And then the sand goes into those fractures and allows the gas to escape. And then the gas flows in to the pipe and up to the surface and to people's homes.
Hydraulic fracturing is largely responsible for the domestic drilling boom. Because of its high cost, it was not widely used until recently, in the 1990s, when the price of natural gas shot up high enough to make it affordable.
And really what was not economical over the last 50 years or so is now economic, and it should continue, particularly if prices stay where they are.
Here are the reserve pits here.
Dr. Theo Colborn is one of the world's leading authorities on endocrine-disrupting chemicals in the environment and their impact on humans.
Down in here, the trucks are coming all the way from Delta, which is 30 miles to here, but we're looking
She has been studying the chemicals used by the industry for drilling and extraction and documenting their effects.
Basically, our first list of the chemicals that were being used was this very, very short and uninteresting list that EPA put together. It certainly wasn't comprehensive, we knew. We found out very rapidly that it was no small list. They don't tell you everything that's in a product. You may only get 5% of what's in that product, and the rest of it is proprietary, or they just don't give it. They don't have to.
It's water and it's sand and it's a surfactant, in other words. But it is also proprietary because every single fracking company, whether it's a Schlumberger or it's a BJ Services or it's a Halliburton, they sell that theirs is the best product. And so it's proprietary. It would be like divulging, why your chocolate is better than somebody else's chocolate because you have those ingredients.
Oil and gas deposits below ground contain toxic compounds that are brought to the surface during drilling. These compounds pollute the environment and can cause health problems. But the impacts of drilling are made even worse by the chemical products that are injected during the process. Dr. Colborn has documented over 200 products used in Colorado drilling. Over 90% contain chemicals with adverse health effects.
Yet you can't get the specific information. I mean, she really has to play the role of the detective in trying to ascertain, what's in the fluid, let alone in what quantities. So you know that when they're not prepared, when any company is not prepared to be transparent like this, they got something to hide. And it goes way beyond being proprietary, because there are ways and means that you could set up, third-party oversight to protect the proprietary information, but they're just not prepared to work with that at all. And in this country, we're talking about the companies that want to start this fracking process being responsible. Forgive me if I have zero confidence in that, especially with Lord John Brown at the helm. Profit before all else. And you heard the guy from ConocoPhillips. Provided prices stay high, we should basically keep on drilling and fracking. Not throughout the film, there is no mention, these guys, of any concern about the environmental or health impacts. And of course, because of the nature of the areas, these are very, very thinly populated. And so the impact on the population there is considered acceptable collateral. Now, we need to understand as well that in this country, we've practiced acceptable collateral in the coal mining industry in this country between 1850 and 1996, a period of 146 years. Some 200,000 people in the mining industry were killed. That's an average of 1,500 a year for 146 years. Top of the league table, by the way, is Lancashire. Second was South Wales. I thought Yorkshire might be right up there, but it appears that's not the case. It's about fourth, I think. But that doesn't include, of course, the deaths due to pneumoconiosis or any of the other respiratory diseases or asthma or whatever that resulted in people living in these environments or downwind of these environments. That 1,500 a year, nearly 200,000 over 146 years, is literally the result of absolute accident involved in the mining industry. That's acceptable collateral. It's also only 170 years since the age at which a child could be made to work down the pit was raised from 6 to 10. So we have come, I'd like to think, we've come some way in the past 170 odd years. But now, what's happening here is we're looking at a potential situation where large tranches of the population are not going to get any choice in it. Because we're entering into an era, shale gas extraction, which is pure Russian roulette. Because the geologists, the petroleum engineers and the chemists have no clue. They will claim they do, of course, but it's no more than an educated guess based on past experience. But that's all it is. It's an educated guess as to how much geology is actually going to be fractured. And where that fluid is going to migrate to. And then where the methane gas that they're trying to mine is also going to migrate to. And the first time you notice it is probably when you go down to a river or a stream, because you see the bubbling. In Brian's Ranch in Queensland, in southern Queensland right now, it's the rainy season, it's the end of the wet season now. But when I spoke to him a couple of weeks ago, he said, Ian, he said, it's unbelievable. He said, of course, my ground's waterlogged, but it's just a sea of bubbles. You can't, obviously, when the ground was hard baked, at least that was some protection against the gas migrating out of the soil. But now that, obviously, the ground is a sea of mud, and it's covered in water, you just see the bubbles coming through. And of course, you heard him say in the film that the environmental agencies and the water authorities say you haven't got a problem. Total denial. This is the area in the US that is now the focus. This is Pennsylvania, which is right in the heart here, right in the heart of the Marcellus Shale. And Pennsylvania, basically the state of Pennsylvania has just said, let's go for it. Let's just frack the crap out of the state. Now, one of the problems with Pennsylvania is that the Appalachian Mountains here, which run up here, the Appalachian Mountains form what's called a triple divide. Yeah. In other words, the water runoff from this area goes in three directions. It goes to the Great Lakes, it goes to the Atlantic Ocean, and it goes down to the Gulf of Mexico via the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. And New York has put a moratorium on fracking, but the people and the state of New York is increasingly concerned because much of its water comes from Pennsylvania. And that's really, the sort of issue that we're going to face here, because Lancashire, Quadrilla are looking at 72 pads, and that's just in the first phase. David Cameron is already talking about 800 wells in the first phase of shale gas drilling in this country. So Lancashire, that's the water from the Lake District, which feeds into Manchester at the moment. But Pennsylvania is just a little bit under the size of England. It's at 95% of the size of England. But the population is less than a quarter that of England. And most of the population is actually centred on the two key cities of Pennsylvania, which is Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. Now, the rest of the territory is very, very thinly populated. In fact, the average population density in here is about the same as we have in places like the Peak District, the North York Moors, the Lake District, even Dartmoor. Yet, of course, by US standards, this is a densely populated state. Not as densely populated as Massachusetts or New York, but certainly, it's up there in the northeast. But the issue really is they might be ready to frack the land, but it's the impact that it's going to have on other states that is the greater concern. Now, the opposition. The industry knows that it's going to meet with opposition, whether it's the traditional opposition groups, the environmentalists, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, or independents. Now, at the moment, they're trying to dismiss, and I'll show you an article that appeared in The Sun last year. They're trying to dismiss anybody who dares to challenge the dash for gas as an eco-mentalist or as a communist or a socialist. Any term they can come up with that will marginalise them. But you know that they know they're in for a run when Quadrilla have just brought in a guy from Betfair who used to work with Microsoft to focus on PR. The guy knows nothing at all about the oil and gas industry. His background is Microsoft and Betfair. I mean, his forte is obviously lobbying at government level. But this is, the fact that they're paying this guy, I mean, I can guarantee you this guy is probably on at least £250,000. So you know that they know they're in for a run here. But if I haven't got your attention, with the prospect of water contamination, soil contamination, and air contamination, this might get your attention, has in some areas. This was an article that appeared in The Observer last June, worry for homeowners who face the threat of fracking. It says property prices in some areas are being threatened by fracking. Well, that was actually based on an article that had been, or a report that had been commissioned by the financial website, This Is Money. And in that report it said shale gas could redraw the economic map of Britain, but prices of houses near wells could fall by 24%. Well, let me tell you the reality. When the gas industry moves in, property prices crash. I mean, this is the case in Blackpool right now. Since the second earthquake, the property market in Blackpool has totally tanked. Now, I have first-hand experience of this because some very good friends of mine who I've spoken in Blackpool probably twice a year for the last 8 years, and every time I speak in Blackpool I always stayed with them. But after the second earthquake in May of 2011, they decided it was time to accelerate their retirement plan, which basically was to leave the area and to move to Spain. So they found an apartment in Spain, moved to Spain, but they obviously still needed to sell their house in the UK. So they contacted estate agents. 3 estate agents came around and looked at the property, this beautiful 5-bedroom house in Porton-le-Fylde, which once upon a time was a very desirable suburb of Blackpool. The estate agents all valued the property at £325,000. But my friend said, you know what, we'd really like to sell it very quickly, so we're going to put it on the market at £250,000. And the estate agents said, but you'll upset the market. And they said, well, not for long, because hopefully someone's going to realise that it's a real bargain and snap it up. Well, so the property's been on the market for almost 2 years. Do you know how many offers they've had on that property? A big fat 0. Well, we were actually talking about the problem of the housing market in Blackpool when I was visiting with them in Spain in the middle of March. And while I was there, they got a phone call from the agent, and they were really excited because they thought, oh, maybe we've got an offer. Well, they didn't have an offer. They had somebody who was interested in the house, and they would have bought it, but it's a couple who are both single parents, they both got 2 kids, and they both have 3-bedroom houses, and they want to move in together. But they can't, because they can't move 4 kids into a 3-bedroom house. So, they were interested in my friend's house, but they can't buy it, because they can't sell their houses. Anyway, they had managed to rent one of their properties, and so they asked the agent if my friend might be prepared to consider renting the 5-bedroom property on the basis that when they sell at least one of their houses, they could then maybe be in a position to buy it. Well, let me tell you, if they sell one of their houses and they come up with an offer, even probably close to 200,000, my friend will probably bite their arm off. Because, it's a liability. It's not an asset right now, it's a liability. Okay, at least they've got somebody living in it, which is, at least keeping it in reasonable shape. But I came back from that trip to Spain and I thought, well, I'm going to do a little bit of research myself. So I called around some of the Blackpool estate agents and, well, you've got to remember they're estate agents. So of course they told me it was a buyer's market. And that right now I could have the pick and choose of almost any property I wanted in Blackpool, especially if I was a cash buyer. Anyway, there was one estate agent in particular who I spoke to who was actually familiar with my work. And he said, Ian, he said, absolutely right. He said, it is a big issue. It's a very concerning issue. And he said, and actually, since the moratorium has been lifted, a lot of property has come onto the market. But most of it will probably never sell unless a ban is introduced. And he said even then, I think people are nervous that it might be lifted, and so in all probability the Blackpool area housing market is not going to be in good shape for at least a decade. Well, it's exactly the same elsewhere. This is North Texas. This is a family called the Ruggerios. This is in the gas field just to the northwest of Dallas. Beautiful part of the States, the hill country there. And here it is. This is from the article. The Ruggerios purchased their home in 2004 and watched a gas and oil company set up wells 300 feet from their back door in September 2009. So 1 year later, the $250,000 property that they put $50,000 worth of work into had been valued at $75,000. The reality is that the only people who would probably offer them $75,000 is a gas company for open access onto their land. This is what they have to deal with. This is the Ruggerios. This is the view from their kitchen window. This is the view from their back garden. Here's the house, here's the well. In Colorado, they are now placing wells directly alongside schools. They are coming, I mean, in Split Estate, you will see that they're actually starting to move into communities. And I published an article in my newsletter a few weeks ago showing how the gas companies are now just not giving a damn, and they're coming right into the heart of communities to access the shale. Remember, the horizontal drilling, because it's tight geology, you can only horizontally drill for a few hundred yards. You can't drill for miles. I mean, in the south of England, we have a rig in the New Forest. It's been there for 23 years. And that drilled 8 miles out into the offshore field because the local authorities of Bournemouth and Poole didn't want a rig on the horizon. So they agreed with the oil company to put the rig inside the New Forest and then drill out under the sea. But that's drilling through porous geology. And this stuff you can only drill a few hundred yards. That's why they're coming right into the towns. To show you what it looks like, because they need 6 to 8 vertical wells per square mile to maximise the shale. This is what it looks like in southern Queensland. This is about a square kilometre. Now here they've got no real issue because they've got relatively open access. Each well requires about 400 truck journeys. Tankers, plus the rig, plus pumps. When you run the frack, you're going to have anything from a dozen to 2 dozen frack pumps. And by the way, when they fire up, and you'll know, especially if you're downwind. So we don't have the infrastructure in this country to deal with this. All the motorways are going to end up looking like the A14, the road from Felixstowe, which is one lane, it's a convoy of containers. We just don't have the infrastructure for this. And the other issue that isn't being discussed yet is the health impact. I mean, we've got a National Health Service that's dying on its feet, and yet this is undoubtedly going to put a burden on the health service. Even though, of course, the oil industry and the government are going to deny that the increase in negative health has anything at all to do with their activities.
And it's going to be fully privatised in 5 years.
Well, so the bottom line is the vast majority of people won't be able to afford the healthcare. So it's part of the culling process. I think we're starting to see that. In Australia, this may look impressive, but because the areas where they're fracking are so thinly populated, these people have often come from literally hundreds of miles to participate in the protest. I mean, they call it, it's under the umbrella of Lock the Gate. But, I mean, they're having some impact in some areas, but, in the scheme of things, unfortunately, they are little more than a mosquito on the back of an elephant. It's a lot easier to stop the process from ever starting than it is to stop it once it's started. But we have a very, very narrow window of opportunity. But the problem is that the government, the British government in particular, already realises that they're going to be up against some opposition. So at the back end of last year, they initiated a bill called the Growth and Infrastructure Bill. This bill went through Parliament in record time, 55 days. The reason it went through in record time was because MPs had been told that this was the bill that was going to remove the bureaucracy and red tape from small businesses. You know, in this current economic climate, we need people to develop entrepreneurial skills. And this is going to take away, you know, all the obstacles that are in place. And of course the MPs went, yeah, okay, I'll vote for that. It rushes through Parliament. It goes to the House of Lords. And when it's being debated in the Lords, there is some realisation that this is actually a little bit more than just a bill that removes red tape from entrepreneurs and small businesses. And the Telegraph, to their credit, actually published this article in February, fears that fracking could be fast-tracked. The Growth and Infrastructure Bill actually creates an opportunity for the British government to decree that something is so significant for the well-being of the UK economy or for our national energy security, even though we can't claim sovereignty of it because it's controlled by the EU, they can simply overrule any local opposition. So, you know, one of the things here is in trying to flag up to local councillors that they've been taken out of the equation. Earlier this year, Quadrilla in the Fylde Peninsula announced that they wouldn't be doing any drilling or fracking in 2013. And some local activists went, yeah, we've got them on the run. And in South Wales and in the Mendips in Somerset, UK Methane announced that they were withdrawing all of the planning applications that they had submitted to the local authorities to place their pads. That's what you saw in that picture from South Queensland. And the activists in Somerset went, yeah, we've got them on the run. Sorry, ain't that simple. The reason that Quadrilla have announced that they're not going to drill this year, the reason that UK Methane have announced that they're pulling their planning applications is because they are waiting for the Growth and Infrastructure Bill to be put on the statute books. It's now got royal assent, by the way, but to be placed on the statute books so that Osborne and Cameron can effectively give these guys the green light. And no amount of local opposition will be taken into account. And at that point, what are you left with? Well, you're left with the situation that they have in Australia, which is basically direct action. Trying to blockade the infrastructure from coming onto the pad. Well, let me show you what happened in Australia, because in Ireland, Shell have been called out paying the Irish Gardaí, the police, directly to protect the Shell infrastructure in North West Ireland, in the Rossport facility, against the local community. In Australia, basically they're doing the same. I mean, just like the miners' strike, you know, where it was the Metropolitan Police that were put into Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire, so that you never had police from the local community, you never had anybody in the local community who might have empathy with the strikers. Well, they're doing the same in Australia. They bring in the police from the cities who have no empathy with the people who live in the country. So let me show you what happened here. This was an attempt at a blockade. In the immediate period prior to this shot being taken, a woman had been seriously injured. She had been knocked over by one of the trucks going onto the pad. An ambulance has been called.
Yeah, Kate, you got permission to go up there, haven't you? He's a photographer.
They want to close the door.
Good. Kate's got permission, yeah? Yeah. Photographer.
You get the picture. I mean, this is the way the corporatocracy works. It is the priority to get the corporations wherever it is that they feel they need to be. The reality is that we don't even need the hydrocarbons in this quantity. In fact, we've never needed the hydrocarbons in this quantity. Has anyone got any idea when it was that Henry Ford was instructed to stop building the electric car? It was 1896. 1896, and he was instructed to stop building the electric cars by a guy called John D. Rockefeller.
And to build one with lamp oil.
Owner of Standard Oil. Had to?
They built one with a lamp oil.
Oh, that was 1946. And he was told to shut that down too. The reason that the electric cars were popular amongst the wealthy in the late 19th century was because they were clean, they were quiet, and they required very little maintenance. You plugged them in at night. There was an infrastructure in the city of New York and other cities where you could drive them in from the short commute. I mean, they weren't the cities that we know today. Plug them in the streets and then drive home. Well, once John D. Rockefeller had got the electric car production line shut down, and by the way, 2/3 of Ford's production in the late 1890s was electric vehicles. In fact, that was pretty much mirrored in New York. There were 2,500 vehicles registered, 1,800 of them were electric. Once John D. Rockefeller got the electric production line shut down, he was also he was buying up and shutting down the electric tramways that had been built in many of the cities around the US, and then replacing them with buses. The argument being that buses were more flexible with regard to the changing demographics. But then as the personal vehicle became more affordable, the buses were wound down so that people had the incentive to have their own personal vehicle, which of course meant that because it was the internal combustion engine, that John D. Rockefeller had created his unending revenue stream. And then with the establishment of the Federal Reserve in 1913 in the US, then that was the first time, by the way, income tax was introduced in the US. But of course, as the government started to finance their projects through borrowing from private bankers, they had to repay the loan and the interest on those loans, so they needed taxation revenues. And even today, the most effective way of fleecing people of their disposable income after income tax is through taxes on hydrocarbons. You know, that's why when we fill up at the pump, we're paying, what, 133, give or take, about 133 for a litre of fuel, yet over 80 pence worth of that is tax. And of course we have a mobility tax. I mean, if you want to get around, you need fuel, and therefore you're paying a tax. The other part of the cabal that controls this is the engine efficiency. So doesn't it strike anybody sort of really quite strange that the average engine efficiency is exactly the same today as it was 70 odd years ago? The average vehicle returns 35 miles a gallon. Obviously some do more, some do less. The average is 35 miles a gallon. It's very carefully calculated, because they've calculated how much fuel they want to sell and how much taxation revenue they want to get. If you start to mess with your engine, you can be charged with tax evasion. It's like if a farmer uses red diesel, i.e. agricultural diesel, on a vehicle he drives on the road, it's tax evasion. There was a guy who came to one of my workshops last year. He was in his 70s. And at the end of the day, he said, "Ian, come outside, I want to show you something." And he opened the bonnet of his 1992 Mercedes, and it's running on a water fuel cell. And he told me it's been running on a water fuel cell since 1993. And I said, "Well, that's amazing." I said, "How come nobody knows about this?" He said, "Because in 1994, he said, I spent 8 months in jail for tax evasion. And when I came out of jail, they told me that I could drive my vehicle with the water fuel cell, but if I told anybody about it, I'd be back in jail for tax evasion." Every vehicle is a revenue collection device. And that's why any alternatives are suppressed. It's a myth that there is any real interest by the hydrocarbon companies or the governments to find viable alternatives. The only way in which they will permit a viable alternative to effectively come into the mainstream is provided there is a way to tax it as efficiently as hydrocarbons. So what they do is they allow 8% of the total market over to alternatives, because one of the reasons that the hydrocarbon industry wants to know about alternatives is so they can shut them down, normally through buying up the patents. And if the person won't sell the patent, then they deal with them in another way. This from the 1990s.
Okay, it never wears out because there's no moving parts.
In the top our news here at 6 o'clock, an age-old dream becoming a reality. A local inventor has discovered a way, hear this, to use water to run your car.
It's a major breakthrough that will no doubt make motorists happy. And as Ralph Robinson explains, the Pentagon is also showing lots of interest in this project.
Water has always been considered a precious commodity, but Stan Meyer's invention may make it even more valuable. He has developed what's called a water fuel cell. It has taken the place of his old gas tank. The water fuel cell breaks down water molecules into oxygen and hydrogen. The hydrogen is used to run his dune buggy.
I don't care if you use rainwater, well water, city water, ocean water. If you don't have any fresh water, go ahead and use snow. If you don't have any snow available to you, then use salt water because there's no adverse effect to the fuel cell.
Meyer started working on this project 4 years ago. He's not a scientist. He isn't even a chemist. In fact, he never graduated from college. Myers was determined, he says, to design something to protect this country from oil embargoes.
And we have calculated that if we take the dune buggy from Los Angeles to New York, we would roughly use 22 gallons of water.
The Pentagon flew a lieutenant colonel in last week to look at Meyer's invention. There's talk of possibly using it in the Star Wars defense program and to run army tanks. Myers is currently perfecting a water fuel cell for cars. It will cost about $1,500. He says it won't need any maintenance and you won't have to replace it. It'll be at least 2 years before the fuel system goes into mass production. The day it happens will be one the fuel industry hates, but it'll put a smile on the face of those who've had to say at one time or another, fill her up.
You heard what the commentator said. it'll be at least 2 years before the water cell goes into production, and that'll be a day the oil industry hates. Well, that'll be a day that the oil industry makes sure doesn't happen. In fact, Stan Myers, he turned down a multi-billion-dollar offer because he wasn't interested. I mean, he was wealthy, he was an inventor. He wasn't interested in signing the invention over to the corporatocracy. He wanted to develop it himself. They made sure that it wasn't going anywhere. So, when you're talking about the issue of fracking, with whoever it is you can address it with, I mean, some people are talking to their MPs, some people are talking to their local councillors, their district councillors, or even just share it around, because we've got to get this like poll tax. It's got to get into the mass consciousness. There's not a lot of point in telling them that, you know, we don't need oil, because they're just going to dismiss you as a rampant conspiracy theorist. So we've got to give a viable alternative. So, you know, we are unfortunately and tragically locked into a hydrocarbon economy. Whatever anybody else says with alternatives like wind power and sea power, yeah, they're all viable potentially, but the reality is that the hydrocarbon industry dominates the corporatocracy. And governments are quite happy to maintain that domination because of the tax revenues they get from it. So we've got to offer viable alternatives. You know, some of the activists are basically, I mean, they call themselves extreme energy activists. And there's no question. I mean, they don't, I think, really help themselves by basically saying we want to shut this down, shut that down, we don't want to do any drilling. Yeah, I mean, that would be the ideal world. We don't need to, period. But, you know, it's baby steps. In the first instance, the critical issue is shutting down the drilling and fracking process on land in this country. If we don't do this, in 10, 15, 20 years, we're not going to recognise this country. You know, the soil is going to be poisoned, we're not going to be able to grow crops, we're not going to be able to raise livestock. You know, we're going to be dependent on the corporations for our drinking water. And if you haven't seen Jesse Ventura's expose of the water scandals in the US, where the water is being taken out of the Great Lakes, shipped to China, and then coming back as bottled water containing fluoride of lithium. I mean, you know, Jesse Ventura comes out with some interesting stuff. Yeah, and most of what he presents is corroborated, easily corroborated. It cannot be dismissed as rampant conspiracy, although the media will try, of course. But, you know, check that out. So imagine a situation where, you know, in a few years' time, we are totally reliant on the corporations for the water. And we should take that seriously, because last year, the chief executive officer of Nestle, a guy called Peter Brabeck, recorded an interview where he stated that water should not be considered a human right. That access to water should be controlled by the corporations. In other words, unless you're a willing corporate slave, then you deny yourself the right to access water. Well, where these guys are ultimately going is they're going to do the same with air. You know, because the air is going to become toxic. So, you know, imagine a situation, we're probably not too far away from it, where houses are hermetically sealed, and to get breathable air, clean air, you pay for it. It's another utility. Otherwise, you're just out there taking your chances. These socio-psychopathic global corporatists have a game plan. It's called Agenda 21. It's been their policy and philosophy since the Earth Conference in Rio in 1992. It was adopted by the UN almost immediately afterwards. And in Agenda 21, it specifically calls for the move towards moving people away from the land into controlled environments, i.e. the cities. And if you see the map of the western states of the US and how much land in the western states the federal government has purchased, primarily so that they can use it obviously for the gas drilling, and they don't have to worry about owners not letting them on the land because they own the land. And what they're going to be left with is, you know, wasteland and cities, the controlled environments. So, you know, we've got to wake up to a reality, which is that within a generation, 2 at the outside, if we allow this to kick off, you know, we really are contributing to creating a future for our children, our grandchildren and future generations that actually doesn't even bear thinking about. And I believe these guys know it. They know exactly what they're doing. That's why they obfuscate, that's why they lie, that's why they deceive, that's why they refuse to be transparent in any way, shape or form. You know, we're sold the meager benefits. This is what we're told are the benefits. Cheap gas. Well, that one got blown out of the water a week or so ago, 2 weeks ago, when the cross-party group that were commissioned to look at the potential for cheap gas from drilling for shale gas and coal bed methane in this country, and they basically said it's not likely to happen. Well, of course it's not likely to happen. When did you ever know prices go down? You know, they're just going to reap the corporate benefits. The balance of trade, I don't think so. You know, our borrowing is increasing. When the current pair of clowns took office, our borrowing was 82% of GDP. Now it's at 86% of GDP, and it's forecast to be at 100% of GDP by 2018. Once the borrowing reaches 100% of GDP, you're owned by the banks. Like Ireland, like Greece, like Spain, like Portugal, Italy, soon France, and the UK. So we may be slowing it down a little bit, but it ain't going away. So that's not going to happen. The energy security, well, we've already explained, we don't have any energy security. That's all taken care of by the Treaty of Lisbon. And here's the UK government's version of behavioural adjustment payments. This is from the Daily Telegraph just last week. The government to offer cheaper energy bills to communities that don't oppose fracking. Yeah, and community briberies. I mean, like, you know, you need a new play park, you need a new community centre. Yeah, they'll throw money at these communities because they know that this is the only way in which they can get them to ignore the risks and the perils associated with the industry being in their backyard. You know, 2 weekends ago, I visited with a guy in Blackpool who is absolutely of the opinion that the damage to his house was caused by the second earthquake. And he showed me all the cracks in the house, around the door frames. He said these weren't there before May 2011. So not only has his house got no value, the insurance company won't touch it because it was an earthquake, act of God. Despite the fact that Quadrilla have actually acknowledged that the seismic events were most probably related to their fracking. But he can't get the repairs done on the house because the insurance companies say it was an act of God. Anyway, then he gets a letter through the post saying, well, we're not insuring your house anyway anymore. So this is the other problem. No one can insure their property. So this is the downside. The water contamination, the soil contamination, the air contamination, the water shortages. You know, this is a country that goes from feast to famine in water in a heartbeat. You know, and where are we going to get these millions of gallons of water that are needed for 800 wells that David Cameron's talking about? Seismic events. The property prices crash wherever you look around the world. Same in US, Canada, Australia, Blackpool. It's not going to be any different anywhere else. No buildings insurance and large areas of the UK potentially uninhabitable. You know, I told you earlier that I'd show you the crass attempt to dismiss those who oppose the agenda. This is from Jeremy Clarkson's column in The Sun. I don't believe for 1 minute that Clarkson wrote this, because this appeared in Clarkson's column the day after the government had lifted the moratorium. So somebody had penned this, and they literally probably paid Clarkson to put his name to it. You know, it's written in Clarkson-esque satire. But the purpose is to demonise those who oppose the dash for gas. I mean, I won't bore you with all the details, but, you know, he calls those who oppose eco-mentalists, hippies that can't afford to do anything because they spend all day up a tree looking at squirrels and humming. They are socialists, they want communism. You know, this is the crass dismissals one of the things that he might be right on is he says, Swampy and his mates say that if we frack under Lancashire, Blackpool Tower will fall into the sea and Preston will cease to exist. Well, you know what? Blackpool Tower was strengthened under the collar immediately after the second earthquake, and that strengthening is still in place there right now. Oh, pure coincidence, of course. And as for Preston being uninhabitable, it's a possibility. It's an absolute distinct possibility.
Sponsored by an attractive lady as well, isn't it?
Well, yeah, exactly. You know, she has nothing to do with the article. She was due to another article, but there she is. And then, you know, we have, this is actually a graphic that was used by BIF, the Britain and Ireland Frack Free. This is the outrageous article. I mean, this was an unbelievable article that Peter Lilly penned in the Telegraph last week. And, I mean, it is institutional denial. It is willful ignorance. Again, trying to dismiss anybody who has the audacity to challenge official orthodoxy. That's what we're up against. So, you know, I'm not interested really in trying to get this into the mainstream media. In fact, every time I have been invited to participate in anything by the BBC or the other mainstream channels, I've always said thanks but no thanks, because anything that's recorded, not a chance. Not a chance. I will only do live stuff. So the mainstream media are not the route. So the method that I'm trying to, if you like, undermine their dash for gas is by holding these events, regardless of how many people, holding these events all around the country. I'm trying to sow the seeds. You know, hopefully you guys will go away and take a look at this stuff for yourself. If you do nothing else, you know, look at Split Estate, this documentary that I've mentioned. Look at Gasland. Look at the documentary put out by the pro-frackers, which is called Frack Nation, which is produced by an Irishman called Phelim McAleer. But you know, look at both sides of the coin. Like, decide for yourself. You know, I've shown you the footage from Brian Monk in Australia because, for me, that is the most damning footage that you can see from an area. I haven't picked and choose from around the world. That's one guy's farm. And I've showed you prima facie evidence of the contamination of the soil, the contamination of the air, and the contamination of the water. So what makes the UK so special that it ain't going to happen here? Nothing. Nothing. So we've got a hell of an uphill battle, but I genuinely believe, I absolutely and genuinely believe that we can stop this. Otherwise, I wouldn't be wasting my time doing over 1,000 miles a week, 5 presentations every night of the week, all around the country, and doing that for nearly 13 weeks. I do believe that we can bring about the change. It starts with everyone obviously trying to educate themselves and then sharing this information and trying to educate others. And if you get the opportunity to spread the word, then get people down to Novotel in Sheffield city centre tomorrow. But there's always something that comes out of left field. And back in 2009, I recorded a presentation called The Green Agenda and Population Reduction. And in that presentation, I made the observation, I said, we are literally a few weeks away from seeing the first stages of global governance being foisted upon us. Because I'd read the scripts for the forthcoming Copenhagen meeting in December 2009. I knew exactly what the game plan was. The game plan was to initiate a global carbon trading process, all based on the global or climate change agenda. And in that presentation I said, barring something coming completely out of the blue, completely out of left field, then by January we are going to have the first stages of global governance in place. Literally a week after I recorded that presentation, the ClimateGate emails were released. Now, a few people have read them, but there is a wonderful document on the web. It's written by a guy called Dr. John P. Costello. It's a document that he first published in January 2010. It's called the ClimateGate emails. And you don't even need to get beyond the first 20 pages to appreciate the magnitude of the lies and the deception perpetrated by the climate scientists, all in the interest of maintaining their grants. And how they were literally manipulating data, how they were manipulating who was or wasn't involved in the peer review process, and so on and so forth. So consequently, those people who did make a little bit of effort to look at the ClimateGate emails knew that all of the climate change agenda had been effectively called into question. Now these guys don't give up because they've been on this quest for 60 years, so they backed off a bit. Now they've had 2 more conferences since Copenhagen, one in Cancun and one in Qatar, and they're still not back to where they thought they were in November 2009. But they're still pushing forward because as of April the 1st this year, for the first time, we have carbon taxes in this country. Australia was on point to test the implementation of carbon taxes, but we're now coming online. So it's not over, they're just taking it a little bit more slowly. So, time is not on our side. I think we've got, at best, the remainder of this year to try to get this into the mass consciousness and get it like poll tax so that the politicians realise and the corporations realise that this is not going to wash with the population of this country. Otherwise, we have to consider alternatives. Anyway, thank you very much for sharing that with me tonight.